All right, welcome back to the Mesopotamian lectures. This will be the final section about the Old Babylonian period and its ruler Hammurabi. Now, Hammurabi is not the only ruler during this dynasty period that we call the Ur-3 dynasty, Ur-3 dynasty, but he is the most famous of the rulers during this time. And in the last lecture, we kind of talked about the importance of writing and the development of writing and its uses as economic and business purposes, essentially. But today, we're going to kind of talk about how Hammurabi and his law code was used. Now, before we get into that, I want to talk about the successor states of the Ur-3 dynasty. Now, Mesopotamian history, like any other, we organize it into various dynasties to kind of help manage all this data. There's too much data if we don't. At the end of Ur-3 period, you can see Ur is right down here, Ur, okay? At the end of the Ur-3 dynasty, they don't seem to have started to decline, or they seem to have started a decline, and they leave this power vacuum, this power gap, that out of this gap will emerge several different groups. Up here we have a city called Mari, all the way up here. And Mari will become very important to talk about in a moment. And right here we have Babylon, right here, Babylon. And really up to this point, we haven't really talked about all of these. Now, this is still in Mesopotamia, and we're going to start expanding out from there. And if you keep following the river up, you end up being up here in Syria, and then eventually you'd hit, the Mediterranean Sea way over here. And then Egypt is down here, right? And so we start connecting all these ancient Near East cultures a little bit more in this lecture. And from the period around 2000 to 16,000 BC, or 2000 to 1600 BC, we see a number of new people groups emerge and new city-states emerge and rise to power really for the first time. And with that, we have groups like the Babylonians and the Amorites. Now, Hammurabi is actually an Amorite, and this is a painting from Egypt. These are the Egyptians here. You can kind of see these people here. This is the Egyptians, right? And then you have everybody on the bottom. These are Amorites, and what you notice about the Amorites is they have very defined features, distinctly compared to the Egyptians. They have colorful costumes. The men have these little sorts of mini afro-looking things and beards, and women are very brightly dressed, right? You can see a bunch of women down here at the bottom, okay? And look at the designs and coloration of their costumes. Egyptians are telling us something about these people, quite clear that they are different than the Egyptians. And these people have brought their goods to Egypt to trade, and even having babies here, like they're having their kids come on the donkeys. And they are pastoralists. And as the other thing that Egyptians are trying to tell us, these people keep flocks of sheep and goats, other animals, and that's how they make their living. And during this time period from about 2000 to 1600 BC, really, at the 2000 mark, the Amorites begin to settle in city-states, and they take control of Babylon. Now, more on Babylon here in a minute. Now we're going to go up to Mari. That's the one that was way up on the northwest that I showed you on the map. Mari is on the upper Euphrates, and it's such a key center of trade between Syria to the west and the north, and Mesopotamia to the south, especially because it's a little bit to the west. So it becomes a hub of trade because it's right in the middle on the river. It becomes very, very prosperous place during this time. There's a huge diplomatic archive that sheds a lot of light on the history of that period, gives us a lot of interesting texts. Some of the government officials writing to each other about their alliances and their trade demands, or what they need, or other personal letters to talk about love interests and political squabbles in the palace, and that people don't like these other people. So we get these new genres of personal letters coming out of this. And Mari was a treasure trove for ancient historians. Mari was ruled by a man named Zimri Lin, and Zimri Lin is here on the left. Zimri ruled for couple decades. And he was actually friends with Hammurabi, or at least an ally of Hammurabi's for the first, 29 years of Hammurabi's reign. And Hammurabi is peaceful. It's not until later that he actually goes on to conquer Mari, and eventually, just Hammurabi couldn't resist. And I guess the wealth probably there in Mari was too much of a draw to him, and he conquers Mari. But Mari is very important to giving us a lot of details from this time. Now, Babylon ascends again during this time period, 2000-ish BC. There's several Amorite rulers in Babylon. So Amorites are the people. Babylon's the place, Amorites are the people. And there are several Amorite rulers before Hammurabi, but we don't really have time to get into each one of them. So we're really just going to talk about Hammurabi. And Hammurabi rules peacefully, like we said, for 29 years, and then, for some reason, gets really aggressive and eventually conquers all the way up to Mari within about 3 years. So it's peaceful 28, 29 years. And then from 29 to 32 of his reign, year 29 to 32 of his reign, he campaigns aggressively. Now, Hammurabi's probably in his 40s to 50s, and he ends up carving up a pretty impressive empire. And maybe empire is not the best term. It's really more of a kingdom, because we're going to talk about, bigger empires in the future for sure. But this is by far the biggest that we've talked about, right? And here Babylon is, right? And this is Sumer, where we've been kind of spending most of our time in the course, and Hammurabi ends up conquering all of that. Then central Mesopotamia and even parts of northern Mesopotamia, like we said, all the way up to Mari. So he ends up really building this really large empire that encompasses almost all of Mesopotamia and the river systems. So now to the reading on Hammurabi's code. There's a lot of kind of quiz questions that kind of fall into this, and it's easy to miss them. But but it's important to note that Hammurabi's law code is not the very first law code that we know of. It's not even the largest. It's basically a partial collection of laws. But what it is the best preserved. It's not the first, it's not the biggest, it's the best preserved. And if you look on the right here, this is Hammurabi dispensing justice, right? He's sitting on the throne dispensing justice. And then all of this text, because it's a public monument, it's carved from basalt. It's a very, very hard rock. It's meant to last, and my goodness, did it last forever, it seems. So Hammurabi's code is the best of these preserved codes, and it's important for ancient historians because a lot of times we're at the mercy of what survives in ancient history, so that we don't have a lot of writing. We just have the things that we find. That's what we have to base it off of. And so this code emphasizes some really important things. One, divine justice. Hammurabi says he's ordained by the gods to place justice in the land. So he makes this monument, this public monument. And everybody's supposed to be able to see it and be like, oh, the king said this. This is the law. But most of it is just copying older laws that were already in existence. But Hammurabi's law is still a very important piece of Mesopotamian culture and society. So here's a couple samples as I introduce it to you. So they're not going to go blind reading it here, but just to help you out, he says, the great God called me. I'm the guardian shepherd whose beneficent shadow spreads over my city in order that the strong might not oppress the weak and that justice be given to the orphan and widow in Babylon. It sounds like biblical to pronounce justice in the land, My strong words I've written up on my mind. So right here we see the God commissioned his justification, and if I ask you that, why does Hammurabi say that he's allowed to make these laws, right? Well, the gods told him he could. And did he pull it off, right? Is this just a set of law codes, or do you notice differences in how people are treated, right? There'll be questions about that, on the primary source. Also, it'd be good, for a unit test, something on a short response about this thing too. So let's talk a little bit more about the laws themselves. So some of these seem pretty harsh. They do seem pretty harsh. They like man, he's really coming down hard on these people and taking capital punishment, like eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of stuff. One example of this that is used a lot, right? It's pretty ridiculous that if a child strikes a parent, then the parent can cut off the hand of the child. Wait, like what? I mean, do we really think they went around doing this? Look, I've got 2 kids myself. If one of them hit me, we'd have a problem, but I don't imagine that I would cut his hand off, right? So what's the real purpose? If they're not actually going around and cutting off hands, what's the purpose of some of these laws? Well, it's to incite people. It's a deterrent to crime, right? If you're scared that mom and dad are going to cut your hand off, you're probably going to behave a little bit differently. And it works in a lot of cases. So these laws, they use force, and they're probably harder on the kids than we are today, for sure, but I don't think they're going around just lopping off hands. Or we'd find a lot of burial sites where there's like a kid missing a hand, right? And we simply don't find that. So he has a really great kingdom. He's the first king that we say kind of consolidates massive territory and conquers other city-states. So what happens in this kingdom? Well, it's pretty simple. Debt. It's an economic collapse, first and foremost. So you look at some of the interest rates, 20% on silver, 33% on grain. You need grain to feed your family, then you got to pay back another third of it. So people can't meet those quotas. It's kind of absurd. It's just way too high. If you ever go to get a credit card and they say, hey, it's 33% interest, you just need to go ahead and throw that out the window. Okay, mortgages are like somewhere between like 5 and 7%. Car payments are not even close to that. Those are absurd levels of interest. And so it's backbreaking to too many people. And as a result of urbanism, people moving to cities, they say, hey, well, I'm not going to live here anymore if I got to pay that much. So they go in, the country goes into debt, and then war comes in, and they're not able to support those wars because they're in debt. And a lot of these cities go into decline, and our data declines. New population groups emerge, but we kind of lose track of things. And those groups that we end up having emerge are the Kassites and the Hurrians. And it kind of becomes a dark age because we kind of start missing quite a bit of information. Once the major civilization kind of falls apart, then records get a lot more difficult to find. And so when people have a decline, they live, they survive. But when it's tough and there's chaos and plagues and disease and all of that, we get a lot less sources. So we don't have as many sources once they go into decline. So inherently it becomes a dark age. Again, not that there's a lot of chaos, just that we kind of run out of things to know about it. But before we kind of end the lecture, we're going to kind of review just the big points here on this blank slide. Number 1, Mesopotamia means the land between 2 rivers. Number 2, they use the rivers to irrigate. It creates a food surplus. That food surplus allows job specialization, new technologies, which is enormously impactful. So basically every part of civilization benefited from having that food surplus. You had the development of writing. It was initially used for business and tax purposes, and then for religious texts and mythology. And then number 5, we have Hammurabi and his law code, which we just went over. So that's kind of a wrap, and we will pick up in the next module with Egypt. Thanks.